Welcome, dear friends, to a winter's tale set in the quiet heart of the English countryside. Picture, if you will, a frosty Christmas Eve, snow resting gently upon thatched rooftops, lamplight glowing golden against the dark, and the faint sound of carols drifting from the village church. It is here, among steaming teacups and evergreen garlands, that our story unfolds. Tonight's mystery is called The Christmas Tree Secret, a Miss Marple mystery. So settle into your armchair, draw the blanket close, and tell me, what tradition makes your Christmas feel truly complete? The church hall in Willowbrook glowed with warmth that Christmas Eve, its windows misted with frost, the air alive with a mingling sense of pine, mulled wine, and freshly baked mince pies. Villagers gathered eagerly, their chatter rising and falling like the carols sung by the choir. At the center of it all stood the grand Christmas tree, decked in ribbons, glass baubles, and a curious collection of heirloom ornaments lent by families from across the village. Children clapped as the vicar pulled the cord and the tree blazed to life, every branch glittering with tiny white lights. For a moment, it seemed perfection. But perfection rarely lingers. A strange hush fell when one of the guests, a gentleman standing near the front, staggered suddenly, his hand clutching at the air. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he collapsed at the foot of the shining tree, his figure casting a dreadful shadow against the golden glow. In the uneasy silence that followed, a woman whispered of a missing silver bell that had adorned the tree only hours before. Another swore she had seen someone tampering with the decorations. Beneath the carols and candlelight, something darker stirred in Willowbrook. Chapter 1. Baubles, Bells, and Gossip. Morning crept gently over Willowbrook, the first rays of pale winter light scattering across rooftops heavy with snow. The little tea-room on the high street, usually a haven for shoppers and weary postmen, found itself crowded earlier than usual. Word of the shocking collapse at the Christmas tree lighting had spread like wildfire, and curiosity drew villagers in as surely as the promise of scones and steaming tea. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of cinnamon and baking bread, but the talk was anything but comforting. Mrs. Larkin, who prided herself on being first with any tidbit of news, leaned forward over her teacup. "Hart, it must have been," she insisted, nodding with conviction. Why, the man was pale as parchment before the carols even began. Not to be outdone, Mr. Sims the butcher shook his head. "Nonsense, Martha. Didn't you see the way he staggered? I tell you, it looked as if he'd been poisoned. I'd stake a pound of sausages on it." Around them, voices overlapped. Some spoke of a fainting spell, others of a family curse, while one elderly gentleman muttered darkly about a quarrel overheard weeks before. Not one had proof, but that hardly mattered. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, her face composed. She did not interrupt, nor did she offer speculation. Instead, her eyes, bright and observant beneath her spectacles, moved from speaker to speaker. She knew, better than most, how gossip, though tangled and often fanciful, could conceal threads of truth. And as the chatter swirled around her like the steam rising from her teacup, Miss Marple thought she had already heard something worth remembering. By mid-morning the tea-room had reached its comfortable hum, teaspoons chiming against china, chairs scraping on the worn wooden floor, and the steady arrival of plates laden with currant buns and golden slices of seed cake. The atmosphere should have been cheerful, yet the villagers' talk still circled back to the previous evening, refusing to rest. Mrs. Weatherby, a stout woman with a fondness for dramatic pronouncements, leaned across the table to her companion. "I heard from young Alice, who was helping set the hall, that one of the decorations was missing this morning. A silver bell it was, quite old, and polished to a shine. She swore she saw it on the tree last night, and today it's gone." The statement caused a ripple of murmurs. Mrs. Larkin sniffed, skeptical. Or perhaps the child imagined it. Bells, baubles, they all look alike in the dark. Miss Marple, seated near the window where the pale light softened her silver hair, did not contradict either woman. She merely sipped her tea, nodding gently, while her sharp mind tucked away the observation. People, she knew, often overlooked small irregularities, yet it was precisely those irregularities that revealed the truth of human behavior. Seed cake was passed round, thick with caraway, and the talk shifted again, whispered theories of jealousy, of debts, of old quarrels best left buried. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking rhythmically in her lap, filtering idle invention from telling detail. The missing silver bell, mentioned almost in passing, lingered with her. Not because of its value, villagers were rarely thieves for profit, but because it was unusual. In Willowbrook, nothing stirred without someone noticing. For such a trifle to vanish on the very night a man had fallen dead beneath the tree. Well, Miss Marple thought, such coincidences were seldom accidents. The lanes of Willowbrook, usually bright with children's laughter and the crunch of boots in fresh snow, lay strangely subdued that December morning. Curtains twitched as figures passed, and mothers, who might otherwise have bundled their little ones into scarves and mittens for sledging, kept them indoors with firm voices and wary glances. The village, wrapped in frost and festooned with holly, ought to have sparkled with Christmas cheer. Instead, it seemed hushed, as if the ivy-clad cottages themselves were holding their breath. Shopkeepers, too, felt the change. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Baines served customers briskly, her words clipped, her eyes darting to the door at every chime of the bell. The postman, usually whistling a carol as he went about his rounds, walked quickly with his head bent, eager to be finished before dark. Even the church bells, calling the faithful to morning prayers, seemed to echo with a sombre note. Miss Marple, making her way along the narrow high street with her basket tucked neatly over her arm, noticed all of it. She had lived long enough to know how fear crept silently into a community, not in great displays of panic, but in small, almost invisible gestures, a mother's tightened grip, a whisper cut short, a door closed more quickly than usual. She paused near the green, watching the frost sparkle on the hedges, her expression calm, though her mind was quietly at work. Fear, she reflected, was often more revealing than bravado. It drew lines between those who had something to hide and those merely frightened by the unknown. And in Willowbrook, beneath the frosted roofs and festive garlands, fear had taken root. Somewhere in the village, Miss Marple thought, was someone who knew precisely why. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Tinsel. 2 days after the tree lighting, the vicarage garden hosted a modest gathering, a few parish helpers, lingering over teacups while frost glittered on the hedges. Conversation, as always, drifted back to the evening of the tragedy. It was Mrs. Peabody, a brisk woman with sharp eyes, who lowered her voice and leaned closer to Miss Marple. "You'll think me fanciful," she began, "but I could have sworn I saw someone near the Christmas tree after the hall had been locked. I'd gone back for my umbrella, Silly thing to forget, and there was a figure moving by the window. A man, tall, or perhaps it was only the shadow of one. I didn't mention it, didn't want to start more gossip. Miss Marple, who was unwrapping her knitting from its basket, looked up mildly. "How very curious, dear. And did you notice anything else? A sound, perhaps?" Mrs. Peabody frowned, knitting her brows as if the memory itself resisted. "A faint clinking, like glass on glass. But it could have been nothing at all." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, her needles beginning their steady rhythm. "So many things in life seem nothing at first." The remark drifted into the air, gentle as steam rising from a teacup, but it lingered in the minds of those who heard. Miss Marple never pressed too hard, never accused or demanded. Instead, she let her questions fall like snowflakes, each one light and unobtrusive, yet collecting into a pattern. Later, as she walked home along the frost-hardened lane, Miss Marple thought again of Mrs. Peabody's shadowy figure and that strange clinking sound. An ornament out of place, perhaps, or a hand rearranging something that should have been left untouched. Whatever the case, it was not nothing. Not at all. The church hall stood silent in the morning light, its festive decorations now seeming oddly forlorn without the laughter and bustle of villagers. Miss Marple had asked, in her gentle, unassuming way, whether she might lend a hand with tidying the branches of the great Christmas tree. The vicar, relieved for any assistance, gladly consented. Up close, the tree was a patchwork of village history. Faded glass baubles from the 1890s, bright paper chains made by schoolchildren, a porcelain angel whose wing bore a careful mend. Yet, as Miss Marple's eyes moved steadily over the branches, she noted a curious absence. There was a gap, no bigger than a fist, where the needles bent as if recently disturbed. It was Mrs. Ellison, the vicar's wife, who sighed as she dusted a near-by table. "It is such a pity, Miss Marple. One of the ornaments lent to us, a silver bell belonging to the Weatherby family, seems to have gone missing. Quite a special piece, I'm told. Passed down through generations, though why anyone would covet such a trifle I cannot imagine." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but within her mind questions quickened. Why indeed? Willowbrook folk were not thieves by habit, and a family heirloom, though charming, was hardly worth more than sentimental value. Yet someone had chosen to take it, and chosen the very night of a man's death to do so. She touched the empty branch lightly with her gloved hand, as if testing the weight of a thought. "People do value trifles most unexpectedly, Mrs. Ellison," she murmured. "Sometimes for reasons we cannot at first see." And with that, Miss Marple resumed her quiet examination of the tree, while in her mind the silver bell began to chime a faint but insistent note. Over the following days, conversations about the tragedy wove themselves through every lane and parlor in Willowbrook. To most ears, the talk was simply more of the same, gossip embroidered, repeated, and embroidered again. But to Miss Marple, listening with quiet attention, the threads did not align so neatly. At Mrs. Baines's greengrocer stall, young Alice, who had spoken of the missing silver bell, now insisted she could not be sure at all. Her cheeks flushed as she avoided Miss Marple's kindly gaze, and she dropped a handful of apples in her fluster. At the post office, Mr. Sims the butcher retold his certainty that the deceased had been poisoned, though he admitted he had never been nearer than the back of the hall. Why, then, his insistence? And there was Mrs. Weatherby, who declared with trembling outrage that the family heirloom had been polished only that morning before it was hung on the tree. Yet when asked, she could not recall who had placed it there. Her defensiveness was too sharp, her voice pitched just a fraction too high. Miss Marple observed it all with the same mild smile, never contradicting, never pressing. She knew the way people betrayed themselves was not always in what they said, but in how they said it, the hesitation before a word, the quickening of breath, the eyes darting away. By her knitting basket, the pattern grew clearer. Here a half-truth, there a nervous correction, and in between, small silences heavy with meaning. It was like piecing together a sampler, seemingly random stitches, yet destined to reveal an image if one looked long enough. To the villagers, it was nothing more than chatter and nerves in a shaken community. To Miss Marple, it was the beginning of a picture, one of hidden motives tucked neatly beneath the holly and tinsel of Willowbrook's Christmas cheer. Chapter 3. The Wrong Man by the Hearth. It was Constable Miller who brought the news, puffed up with importance as he strode into the tea-room that afternoon. His boots, still dusted with frost, rang against the floorboards as he announced, "We've got him, make no mistake." The fellow was seen loitering by the church hall the very night it happened. Young Thomas Briggs, the gardener from Marleycombe Road. Had been drinking, too. Always a bad sort, that one. A ripple of relief moved through the gathered villagers. Mrs. Larkin gave a satisfied nod. "I said all along it would be one of the rougher element. Never trusted that lad. Always lurking about with mud on his boots." The butcher, Mr. Sims, muttered something about justice being swift, while others, visibly reassured, returned to their teacups and seed cake with renewed appetite. To them, the matter seemed closed. A likely suspect, a ready explanation, and the comforting sense that order had been restored. Only Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner with her knitting, showed no such relief. Her needles clicked steadily, but her eyes, thoughtful and penetrating, lingered on the constable. She had known young Thomas Briggs since he was a boy, and though he had his faults, an untidy manner, a fondness for ale, she had never seen in him the malice or calculation required for such a deed. Moreover, arrests made too quickly often concealed the true story. It was far easier to settle suspicion on the obvious than to look deeper into hidden motives. Miss Marple's lips pursed ever so slightly, though she said nothing aloud. Instead, she made a mental note. She would pay a call on Thomas Briggs's mother. The truth, she had often found, lay not in official reports or grand announcements, but in the quiet corners where others seldom cared to look. That same afternoon, Miss Marple took the familiar lane that wound toward the Briggs cottage, her breath rising in pale clouds against the frosty air. The little house stood tucked behind a hedge of holly, its chimney puffing smoke into the gray sky. She knocked softly and was soon greeted by Mrs. Briggs, a weary woman with kind eyes and hands reddened from years of washing and scrubbing. "Why, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, ushering her in, "what a surprise! Do come through. The kettle's just boiled." Inside, the sitting-room was humble but tidy, smelling faintly of lavender polish and coal smoke. A plate of shortbread appeared almost at once, and Miss Marple settled into a chair near the fire, her manner as mild and unthreatening as ever. "I hear there's been some trouble concerning your Thomas," she began gently, her knitting resting in her lap. Mrs. Briggs sighed heavily. "Trouble follows him, I don't deny it. He's careless, likes his pint too well, and he speaks out of turn. But wicked? No, Miss Marple. Never. He'd give away his last shilling if a neighbour asked. He hasn't a cruel bone in him." As the conversation wound on, Miss Marple listened more than she spoke, observing the mother's steadfast conviction, the absence of guile in her tone. A son might be foolish, even reckless, but cruelty required a different fibre altogether. When Miss Marple rose to leave, she patted Mrs. Briggs's hand kindly. "I thank you for the tea. You've been most helpful, my dear." And as she walked back toward the village, the snow crunching beneath her boots, Miss Marple's intuition solidified into quiet certainty. The constable had erred. Thomas Briggs might be feckless, but he was not a murderer. The true culprit, she suspected, remained comfortably hidden among those less obvious. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her own neat little cottage on the edge of the village green. The world outside lay hushed beneath a crust of frost, windows aglow with lamplight, smoke rising in gentle curls. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, casting warm patterns upon the wallpaper. She drew her chair close, set her knitting aside, and folded her hands in quiet contemplation. Poor Thomas Briggs! The boy had his faults, untidiness, intemperance, a foolish tongue after drink, but those were the sins of youth, not the hallmarks of murder. Motives, Miss Marple reminded herself, were rarely so clumsy. Men did not kill for nothing, nor did they strike blindly in the midst of a church hall filled with neighbors. No, this crime bore the touch of something more deliberate. Her mind wandered back over the tree lighting, the sudden collapse, the missing silver bell, the glances exchanged like whispered secrets. Whoever had planned such a deed had taken pains, weaving malice into the merriest of occasions. It was clever work, and personal, very personal. Miss Marple poked the fire thoughtfully. "A gardener," she murmured to the quiet room, "would have no quarrel with an ornament. But a quarrel there must be." The village, wrapped tonight in its illusion of peace, harbored someone capable of using celebration as cover for cruelty. And that someone, Miss Marple thought, was counting on the constable's simple satisfaction with a convenient suspect. She settled back, her blue eyes alight with quiet determination. The wrong man was under arrest, but the right one had already made a slip. It was in the details, always in the details, and Miss Marple, as ever, intended to find them. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Holly Wreath. It was Mrs. Weatherby, the oldest inhabitant of Willowbrook, who first stirred the embers of memory. She was a thin, wiry woman with a shawl that seemed to have known as many winters as she had, and a tongue sharpened by years of watching and listening. Seated near the tea-room fire, she leaned closer to her companions and lowered her voice, though not so low that Miss Marple failed to hear. "You all pretend to forget," she said with relish, "but I remember it plain as yesterday. The quarrel between old Mr. Ellison, God rest him, and the Partridge family. A dreadful business it was, and over land, as such things often are. Several heads turned at once. The Partridges were still a respected name in the village, though not without their shadows." Mrs. Weatherby continued, undeterred by the sudden hush. "It was just after the war. A strip of meadow, valuable for grazing, and both families claimed it. Harsh words were spoken, and there was even talk of court, though it never came to that. But the enmity lingered. Mr. Ellison never forgave, and neither did they. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused ever so slightly, though her expression remained mild. Old quarrels, she knew, had a way of sleeping lightly, easily woken by opportunity, resentment, or greed. The tea-room buzzed as others began to speculate, piecing together vague recollections into a patchwork of suspicion. Could the recent tragedy have roots reaching back decades? Miss Marple, listening quietly, thought it very possible indeed. For human nature, she reflected, seldom changed. A bitterness once sown might bear fruit long after the first quarrel was forgotten by most. And in Willowbrook, it seemed, the past was not quite done with the present. The talk in the tea-room soon shifted, as talk in villages always does, from old quarrels to the more tantalizing matter of money. It was Mr. Sims, polishing his spectacles with exaggerated care, who first broached the subject. "They say Mr. Ellison wasn't half so well off as he liked folks to think. Debts, that's what I've heard. And where there are debts, there's usually trouble over inheritance." A murmur of agreement rippled round the tables. Mrs. Larkin leaned forward, her voice just above a whisper. "There's talk of a new will, too. Some say it didn't leave as much to the family as they expected. If that's true, well, disappointment can breed no end of unpleasantness." Someone else mentioned a niece, pretty but poor, who had lately been seen in the company of a gentleman with more ambition than means. There were hints of promises made, of alliances encouraged, if only the money were secure. Another spoke of a nephew, long resentful, who had never forgiven being overlooked in earlier provisions. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression politely neutral, but her mind was alert. Money and marriage, the two great engines of village drama, so often provided both motive and opportunity for mischief. She had seen it before, the hope of an inheritance sparking rivalry, the lure of a wealthy match tempting hearts astray, the bitterness of exclusion fermenting into rage. What intrigued her most was the sudden eagerness with which people now recalled every rumor and half-truth. Affairs hinted at, grudges nursed, fortunes expected and lost. Beneath the garlands and wreaths of Christmas, Willowbrook seemed tangled in a web of envy and desire, each thread pulled tight by whispers of money and marriage. And Miss Marple, quietly knitting by the window, knew that such whispers were rarely harmless. They were the faint but certain signs of something much darker at work. As the talk around her drifted from one tantalizing morsel of gossip to another, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered down quieter, more private lanes. She had, after all, seen such patterns before, not here in Willowbrook, but in St. Mary Mead, in market towns, in little cottages and grand houses alike. The details changed, but the hearts of people seldom did. There was, for instance, the case of young Lydia Briggs years ago, who had quarrelled with her sister over a trifling legacy, a silver brooch, nothing more. The bitterness that sprang from that small object had led to years of estrangement, as sharp and enduring as any knife. People might disguise their grievances beneath politeness, but those grievances festered all the same. And then there had been the vicar's niece, who set her heart upon a match deemed unsuitable. Promises had been made in secret, alliances formed upon the shaky foundation of what might be gained through money. Hearts had been broken, of course, but reputations, too, and such wounds had lingered far longer than anyone would admit. Here in Willowbrook, Miss Marple could see the same threads being woven. A will disputed, a marriage delayed, an ornament stolen, each detail seemingly small, yet bound together by the same knots of envy, resentment, and quiet desperation. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was astonishingly consistent. However much circumstances changed, the style of one's dress, the price of butter, the arrival of electric lamps in the high street, the old failings of pride, greed, and jealousy marched on unaltered. She folded her hands in her lap, her eyes gentle but shrewd. The truth was not yet plain, not in every particular. But she felt the outline forming, as one sees the shape of a figure beneath a shroud. And Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, knew that when such patterns emerged, it was only a matter of time before the concealed became visible to all. Chapter 5. The Ornament That Shouldn't Shine. The village had just begun to settle again, its fears dulled by routine and the comforting bustle of Christmas preparations, when another shock sent a chill deeper than any frost. It happened at the vicarage, of all places, that most respectable and seemingly safe of homes. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Hughes, had invited a small circle to tea, a few neighbors, the curate, and Miss Marple herself. The air was filled with the scent of cinnamon biscuits and the glow of holly twined round the mantel. The talk, though guarded, still strayed to the mysterious death at the tree-lighting. Polite laughter rose and fell like fragile glass. It was during the second pot of tea that the commotion began. Mrs. Hughes, a woman of cheerful constitution, lifted her cup, sipped, and within moments turned pale. Her hand trembled so violently that the china rattled against its saucer. A startled hush swept the room as she clutched at her throat. The curate leapt to his feet, while another guest fetched water in panic. Miss Marple, calm amidst the flurry, noticed the peculiar bitterness clinging to the rim of the abandoned cup. Mrs. Hughes recovered after a few dreadful minutes, thanks to the prompt administration of salts, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone had meant harm. A second incident, so soon after the first, shattered the fragile illusion that the earlier tragedy had been an unfortunate accident. Whispers turned to gasps, fear to dread. Who, in the safety of the vicarage drawing-room, could harbor such intent? And more troubling still, what connected this attempt to the death beneath the Christmas tree? Miss Marple's eyes lowered thoughtfully, her fingers knitting steadily in her lap. The stakes had risen, and she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that the true culprit was growing reckless. The very next day, Willowbrook awoke to yet another whisper running along its frosted lanes. The silver bell had returned. Children on their way to school first noticed it, hanging innocently among the branches of the great Christmas tree in the church hall. No longer tarnished or dulled by age, the ornament gleamed as though freshly polished, catching the light with an almost insolent brilliance. By mid-morning, half the village had gathered to see it. There it was, swinging ever so slightly in the draught from the hall door, as if mocking all who had speculated about its disappearance. Some villagers muttered about childish pranks, others claimed it must have been misplaced and only now restored by a guilty conscience. Yet Miss Marple, standing quietly near the back, felt a distinct unease. It was not merely the bell's reappearance that troubled her, but the manner of it. It had not been hung where it originally belonged, among the higher boughs, near the star. Instead, it was placed lower, at a level where every passer-by might notice it. A calculated choice, she thought, for those who wished to draw attention. Her eyes lingered on the polished surface. Whoever had handled it had taken time and care, restoring the shine with deliberate precision. Why, unless the bell itself was meant to carry some message? Miss Marple's knitting bag hung from her arm, and she touched it absently, her mind already working in quiet, steady loops. The villagers might see the bell as the end of a mystery, but she knew better. Its sudden return was not the conclusion of a story, but the turning of a page. For in the stillness of the hall, beneath the tinsel and evergreen, that small ornament now gleamed like a clue no one but she cared to notice. That evening, as dusk pressed its violet cloak over Willowbrook, cottage windows glowed with firelight and the faint strains of carols drifted from parlors. The village looked every bit the picture of Christmas charm, wreaths bright on doors, pudding steaming on kitchen stoves, holly glistening in frosted hedgerows. Yet beneath the surface, unease ran like a cold undercurrent. Conversations were hushed, glances wary. Neighbors who once lingered at gates now hurried home before nightfall. Miss Marple, seated comfortably by her hearth, watched the flames leap and curl with thoughtful eyes. On the surface, all was warmth and tranquillity. But she knew too well that shadows grow darkest beside the firelight. Two incidents now, a sudden death and an attempted poisoning, could hardly be dismissed as coincidence. The return of the bell only deepened the puzzle, its polished shine like a mocking smile from the culprit themselves. There was something almost theatrical in it, she mused, a killer who wished not merely to act, but to be noticed. Yet in seeking to flaunt their cleverness, they revealed a dangerous flaw, pride. Pride made people careless. Pride led them to place a bell lower than it ought to be, or to misjudge the bitterness in a cup of tea. Miss Marple leaned closer to the fire, her expression unreadable, her needles clicking softly in rhythm with her thoughts. The killer's hand was tightening, yes, but in doing so, it left a trail of threads behind. Threads she had seen before in other places, other tragedies, woven always from the same fibers of human weakness. The village still basked in its seasonal glow, but Miss Marple knew the truth. Somewhere amid that glow lurked a darkness too restless to remain hidden for long. And soon, very soon, it would betray itself completely. Chapter 6. Needles Among the Branches. It was with her usual air of quiet simplicity that Miss Marple extended her invitations. Nothing grand, nothing to stir suspicion, merely a few notes delivered by hand, suggesting a little gathering at her cottage for tea and cake. So pleasant, she wrote, to enjoy company before the final rush of Christmas preparations. In a village like Willowbrook, such courtesies were never questioned. On the appointed afternoon, her parlor glowed with lamplight, the air fragrant with freshly baked seed cake and the comforting steam of the teapot. A sprig of holly adorned the mantel, and the clock ticked with its gentle insistence. The guests arrived in twos and threes. The vicar's wife, still a touch pale after her recent ordeal, young Mr. Fletcher, ever eager to be seen in company, Mrs. Larkin, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, and even Constable Rowe, who, though surprised to be included, could hardly refuse Miss Marple's kind insistence. Seated comfortably with saucers balanced and napkins in laps, the group exchanged pleasantries. Miss Marple, in her neat cardigan and lace collar, presided with gentle warmth, refilling cups, offering slices of cake, listening with all the attentiveness of a fond aunt. Yet beneath her kindly nods and murmurs of agreement, her mind moved with precision. For this was no ordinary tea. Each question she asked, each story she prompted, was carefully chosen. A recollection of the Christmas tree lighting, a casual mention of the silver bell, a musing upon the curious bitterness sometimes found in tea. She spoke lightly, never accusing, but with just enough emphasis to set her guests talking, to coax out those small slips of the tongue that reveal far more than confessions ever could. Her trap was not of snares or locks, but of words, of memory, of human nature itself. And as her guests settled deeper into their chairs, lulled by comfort and the promise of another slice of cake, Miss Marple's net began, quietly, invisibly, to tighten. The conversation drifted easily, as Miss Marple intended, from the weather to the bustle of Christmas shopping, and then, ever so lightly, toward the matter of the church hall decorations. "How clever it was of the ladies' committee," she remarked, buttering a scone with careful precision, "to place the silver ornaments among the holly branches. Such a shine they gave the whole tree. Though I did wonder at the bell, so curious, going missing and then reappearing again, brighter than before." Her tone was mild, almost dreamy, but her eyes, sharp beneath their lowered lashes, missed nothing. The vicar's wife nodded distractedly, though her hand tightened briefly on her teacup. Mr. Fletcher laughed rather too loudly, insisting such trifles were hardly worth concern. Mrs. Larkin pursed her lips and declared that children, no doubt, had been at it. But it was another guest, one who had so far spoken little, who betrayed themselves with the smallest of gestures. At the mention of the polished bell, their spoon clattered faintly against the saucer, and a flush rose to their cheeks before they could compose it away. It was the kind of slip most would overlook, buried quickly beneath polite chatter. Miss Marple, however, had built her life upon noticing such slips. She pressed gently, no more than a fond musing about how certain ornaments carried history, how family pieces often held curious sentimental value. Again, the same flicker of unease, a shifting in the chair, an unwillingness to meet her gaze. Miss Marple poured another cup, her movement serene, her words kindly. She did not reveal her hand, nor show that she had seen what she needed. Yet inwardly, she folded the reaction neatly into the pattern taking shape in her mind. The bell was no longer just an ornament. It was the fulcrum upon which this entire tragedy turned, and the person who had betrayed their nerves over it was closer to exposure than they could possibly imagine. The fire crackled softly, casting a mellow glow over the little gathering. The teacups had been drained and refilled, crumbs of seed cake lay upon napkins, and the conversation, easy, unthreatening, wound its way like a stream over familiar stones. It was precisely then, when comfort and routine lulled the senses, that Miss Marple drew the net tight. "So curious," she said, in her mild, wandering way, "how certain ornaments seem almost alive with memory. Why, I recall a silver bell from my own childhood, rather like the one in the church hall. My mother always insisted it hung at the very top of the tree, though as children we longed to move it lower, where we could admire it more closely. Of course, one would only polish it on Christmas Eve, never sooner. Tradition, you know." Her words floated out like smoke, innocent enough. Yet the room fell just perceptibly still. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she watched the play of expressions, polite nods, fond chuckles, and then the misstep. A voice, strained yet too quick, replied, "But surely it was polished days before. One mustn't wait till the very evening. The tarnish would show dreadfully." It was said with a defensive brightness, a haste that rang out sharper than any bell. For an instant, silence hung in the air, broken only by the ticking clock. Then conversation resumed, but the damage was done. The mask had cracked. Miss Marple, her needles clicking serenely in her lap, smiled as though nothing were amiss. Yet inwardly she knew the truth. Only one who had handled that missing bell, who had fretted over its gleam, could have made such a careless correction. Pride, again, the undoing of so many clever criminals. She offered another slice of cake, her tone sweet as sugar, but in her mind the verdict was already sealed. The trap had sprung, and the killer, though still seated comfortably by her fire, had all but confessed. Chapter 7. The Secret Beneath the Christmas Tree. The following evening, at the vicarage drawing-room, a small but tense assembly gathered. Outside, frost glazed the hedgerows silver, while inside the fire glowed bright upon anxious faces. Miss Marple sat quietly in her accustomed chair, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. At the vicar's request, though truly at her gentle insistence, she had agreed to lay out her little observations, as she so modestly put it. "My dear friends," she began, her tone as calm as if she were describing the weather, "the truth of this unhappy affair lies not in wild speculation, but in the simple study of human nature, and, I might add, in a Christmas ornament." A ripple went round the room. She continued serenely. The silver bell, which vanished and then returned, polished to brilliance, was not prized for its appearance. It was prized for what it contained. Within its hollow, hidden cleverly, was a small quantity of powdered poison, the very same that caused Mr. Ellison's sudden collapse, and nearly ended poor Mrs. Hughes's tea. Gasps answered her words, followed by a shocked silence. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, almost grandmotherly. "You see, the bell was meant to be admired, passed hand to hand as villagers remarked upon its unusual sheen. A perfect vehicle for concealment. But when the first attempt succeeded too well, the culprit grew anxious, reckless. They replaced the bell, hoping to divert suspicion by its return. Yet in polishing it, in displaying it differently, they betrayed themselves." Her eyes moved across the gathering, gentle but unflinching. It was never about the ornament itself, but about money, resentment, and long-buried grievances, motives as old as the hills. The bell was simply the means. And in their eagerness to prove clever, our culprit made the smallest of slips. A slip, I am afraid, that told me everything. The room held its breath, waiting for the name that must surely follow. Miss Marple, hands folded, prepared to deliver it. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle, like snow blanketing the lane outside. Then, in her gentle, deliberate way, she continued, "The bell, you see, was not merely a hollow trinket. It once belonged to the Ellison family, handed down with a curious little secret. Inside, hidden beneath a removable cap, were folded papers, old letters, long forgotten by some, but not by others. Those letters spoke of a scandal from years past, one that threatened the comfortable respectability of certain members of the family." She paused, her eyes mild as ever. Mr. Ellison had only recently rediscovered the hiding-place. It is my belief he opened the bell and read the letters again, and realized the power they held. His intention, whether to reveal or to amend his will, was not malicious, but it meant others might lose far more than money. They stood to lose reputation, standing, and the very position they had built for themselves. A murmur stirred among the listeners. Miss Marple went on, her voice soft but steady. Thus the motive was not sudden rage. No, it was the cold hand of desperation. To preserve appearances, to guard a secret that could undo a lifetime's pretense. Such desperation will drive people to acts they never imagined themselves capable of. Even murder, disguised amidst carols and Christmas cheer. The vicar's wife shivered, drawing her shawl closer. Someone muttered about the cruelty of using a holiday gathering as cover. Miss Marple only nodded. Yes. That was the cleverness of it, and also its undoing. Evil so rarely lurks in the shadows alone. It seeks the brightest places, where no one thinks to look. Her knitting lay untouched beside her, her expression both kind and grave. And so our culprit acted not from hatred, but from fear, the fear of exposure. Yet in striving to bury the past, they unearthed it for all to see. The room, heavy with shock, waited for the final, inexorable name. For a moment after Miss Marple's final words, the drawing-room was utterly still. The ticking of the mantel clock sounded unnaturally loud, each beat echoing the hearts of those present. All eyes turned toward the figure she had so quietly, so inevitably unmasked. The accused sat frozen, the color draining from their face. A hand twitched as if to protest, but no words came. The silence stretched, brittle as frost on a window-pane. Then, like the first gust before a storm, a murmur rippled through the room. Villagers exchanged glances, the pieces at last fitting together. What had seemed a dozen harmless oddities now blazed with cruel clarity. Someone gasped, a sharp intake of breath that cut through the murmurs. The vicar, grave and pale, folded his hands as though in prayer. Mrs. Larkin clutched her shawl and whispered, "I never would have believed it, never." Others nodded, stricken, half in pity, half in dread. For all the scandal revealed, this was still one of their own, bound to them by years of shared Christmases, christenings, and funerals. The guilty one at last stirred, lips parting in a futile attempt at denial. But Miss Marple's quiet eyes met theirs, and the protest withered before it found voice. A tremor ran through their shoulders, and they sank back into the chair, defeated. The game, their carefully woven pretense, was over. Shock and sorrow mingled in the air, heavy as the scent of holly and candle wax. The room seemed to breathe as one, a collective shudder at the darkness that had lain hidden beneath familiar faces and festive garlands. At the edge of the gathering, Miss Marple sat very still, her expression not triumphant but gently sad. She understood, as few others did, that wickedness often sprouted not from monstrous hearts but from fear, vanity, and weakness. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, solemn and steady. Within the room, the village held its breath, the truth now fully revealed, and the world, for a moment, forever altered. Chapter 8. Candles, Carols, and Quiet Shadows. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear, the rooftops of Willowbrook silvered with frost that glittered in the pale sun. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the comforting scent of coal fires and roasting meats. Church bells rang across the valley, their peals bright and steady, calling the villagers to worship. One might have thought it was any other Christmas day, the sort celebrated in picture books, steeped in cheer and tradition. Yet beneath the familiar rituals, an unspoken weight lingered. In the tea-room, Mrs. Larkin served slices of rich fruit-cake with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. Customers offered polite smiles, though their conversations drifted inevitably toward hushed speculation. "A dreadful business," murmured one, shaking his head. Another, eyes lowered, muttered that such darkness seemed impossible in a place as small and close-knit as theirs. And yet it had happened, right there under the twinkling Christmas lights. At the church, the congregation filled the pews, their voices raised in carols. But even, hark! The herald angels sing carried a certain hesitation, as though each singer was mindful of the chill that had fallen over their festivities. The vicar's sermon spoke of light conquering darkness, of hope enduring even when shadows gather. His words were gentle but pointed, and many lowered their eyes, considering what had transpired. Children, mercifully untroubled by the full truth, dashed through the lanes in scarves and mittens, chasing one another with snowballs. Their laughter rang out brightly, a reminder that life continues, even when grief or fear tugs at the edges. Parents, however, kept closer watch than usual, their glances sharp whenever a stranger passed or a shadow fell too long across a frosted hedge. In many homes, candles burned in windows, part tradition, part unspoken vigil. At the vicarage, a wreath of holly and ivy still hung on the door, but its glossy leaves seemed darker now, touched by the weight of memory. Families gathered around hearths, carving turkeys, pulling crackers, and sharing small tokens wrapped in brown paper or shiny ribbon. Yet even in these circles of warmth, there were moments of silence, pauses where eyes met and words faltered. And through it all, Miss Marple moved quietly, her presence unobtrusive yet steady. She walked the frosted lanes with her scarf tucked neatly about her shoulders, stopping to exchange kind words with those she passed. She listened with her usual patience, offering comfort without judgment. Some villagers confided their unease, others their relief that the truth had been revealed before more lives were lost. To each, she responded with the same gentle assurance, that wickedness, though real, was never stronger than the resilience of ordinary goodness. As the day faded into twilight and candles were lit once more, Willowbrook stood at a curious threshold. Christmas had not been ruined, the traditions endured, the bells still rang, the carols were sung. But the holiday had been forever altered, threaded through with memory of the shadow that had fallen and the truth that had come to light. And though the village breathed again, it did so more carefully, aware that even among carols and candles, darkness sometimes lingered. The fire in Miss Marple's little sitting-room crackled cheerfully, its flames casting a warm glow against the polished brass of the hearth. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily across the lane, softening rooftops and hedgerows into a hushed, white world. Inside, all was calm, a teapot gently steaming on the table, her knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm, and the faint scent of lavender sachets tucked neatly into the corners of the room. To anyone passing by, it was a picture of peace, but Miss Marple's thoughts were quietly occupied with less tranquil matters. She had, after all, seen it before, the way human frailty has a habit of slipping through even the most carefully arranged masks. People, she reflected, could be so very clever in concealing their secrets, in wrapping themselves in layers of respectability or charm. And yet, beneath it all, the same patterns emerged: pride, jealousy, greed, or the desperate fear of losing something they held dear. How often such weaknesses surfaced at the most inconvenient of times, like threads tugging loose in a carefully woven fabric. Her needles paused for a moment as she considered the silver bell. A small thing, so unassuming in its way, and yet it had carried the weight of a scandal, a truth so heavy that someone had been willing to kill to keep it hidden. How curious that the object meant to shine as a festive decoration had become the very vessel of guilt. Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. Ornaments, after all, could be polished and displayed, but human nature could not so easily be made to sparkle without betraying its flaws. She poured herself another cup of tea, the amber liquid curling into the porcelain with a comforting familiarity. Taking a sip, she reflected on the villagers' reactions, their fear, their gossip, their swift relief when the police had arrested the wrong man. Such eagerness to believe the first tidy explanation, she mused, was a very human failing. People disliked uncertainty. They longed for neatness, even when truth itself was rarely neat. And yet, she smiled faintly, the truth had a way of pressing itself forward, like a stubborn crocus through snow. Lies could hold for a time, secrets could sleep quietly, but sooner or later a chance remark, a forgotten glance, or an ornament placed just so would betray the facade. It was not brilliance on her part, she always reminded herself, merely attentiveness. One had only to listen, to notice, to compare human behavior against the patterns it so reliably followed. Her needles began to click once more, steady and sure. Outside, the bells of the church tolled for evening service, their tones soft in the snowy air. Miss Marple glanced toward the window, her expression thoughtful but serene. The world, for all its troubles, had settled again into a rhythm of peace. Shadows had passed, but candles still burned, and carols were still sung. And in the quiet of her parlor, she found comfort in the certainty that though darkness might visit even the most charming village, truth, in the end, would always find its way to the surface, be why the week's end. Willowbrook had begun to settle back into its familiar patterns, though the memory of recent events lingered like frost that refused to melt in shaded corners. The church bell still rang, the grocer's boy still delivered parcels up and down the lanes, and Mrs. Larkin's tea-room once more hummed with the clink of china and the comfort of fruit scones. Yet beneath this comforting surface, something subtle had shifted. The villagers moved with a new awareness, a watchfulness that had not been there before. Where once gossip had been light-hearted, about a cousin's engagement or the vicar's new waistcoat, it now carried a sharper edge. People spoke more carefully, measuring their words, as though conscious that secrets had a way of slipping out in the most unexpected of places. Old quarrels seemed smaller, petty grievances less worth pursuing, now that everyone had seen how resentment, left untended, could fester into something dreadful. Children returned to the lanes, their laughter scattering through the frosty air, but their parents watched them with closer eyes, unwilling to take safety for granted. The Christmas decorations remained in the church hall, though many villagers admitted to a shiver when they looked at the gleaming silver bell, restored to its branch. What once had seemed a mere trinket now stood as a reminder of how close darkness could lie beneath the surface of ordinary life. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned quietly to her own rhythms. There was satisfaction, of course, in having seen the truth emerge, in knowing that justice, of a sort, had been served. But she did not dwell on triumph. To her mind, it was not cleverness so much as a matter of listening and observing, of seeing the patterns of human nature that so many chose to ignore. On a crisp afternoon, she knelt in her small garden, tidying the beds where hardy winter cabbages and leeks stood against the cold. The air was sharp, her breath rising in little clouds as she trimmed dead leaves and brushed frost from the path. There was comfort in this work, in the honest steadiness of soil and plant. Gardens, she reflected, were not unlike people. Both required patience, attentiveness, and a readiness to deal with weeds before they took root. Now and then a villager would pass her gate, pausing to exchange a word or two. Some thanked her quietly, their eyes filled with unspoken gratitude. Others simply offered a smile, a nod, or a remark about the weather. Miss Marple responded with her customary gentleness, never claiming more than her share of credit. She knew that life would resume, as it always did, but not unchanged. As twilight deepened, she stood at her gate, looking out over the frosted hedgerows and lamplight flickering to life across the village. There would be more Christmases, more laughter, more secrets, and no doubt, more shadows. But for now, Willowbrook breathed again, wiser, perhaps, and just a little more wary. And Miss Marple, with quiet satisfaction, returned to her knitting and her garden, content to wait and watch, as she always had. And so, dear friends, the mystery of the Christmas tree secret comes to its quiet close. In Willowbrook, the carols rise once more, fires burn cheerfully in every hearth, and families gather to share plum pudding and laughter. The darkness that once flickered among the village lanes has been named, faced, and laid to rest. Yet, as Miss Marple well knows, light and shadow walk side by side in every place, even in the most charming of English villages. What lingers, perhaps, is not the fear, but the reminder that beneath tinsel and holly, secrets may slumber, waiting only for a sharp eye or a chance slip of the tongue to bring them forth. Miss Marple, with her quiet knitting and her thoughtful observations, once again proves that wisdom often hides in the most unassuming of places. But now the bells are chiming, and the village settles into the comfort of Christmas. The air is filled with the scent of pine and mince pies, the snow crunches underfoot, and children's laughter weaves through the frosty night. Life goes on, touched but not undone. And so I ask you, as we draw the curtains on this tale, would you have noticed the missing silver bell glinting strangely among the branches? Or, like so many in Willowbrook, might you have believed the constable's first convenient suspect? Share your thoughts in the comments, my friends. I'd love to hear them. Until next time, keep your tea warm, your heart curious, and your eyes open for the quiet mysteries that may be hidden in plain sight. Good night, and may your Christmas be filled with peace, warmth, and just a touch of wonder.